Can't Escape the Magic by Art Fox. Chapter 20. Cinna stared at the bedroom door as the adult's words filtered in. An inflation, he thought. That was the reason for so much suffering in this country. He felt anger coiled tightly in his chest. He wanted to scream, to rage, to cry at the injustice of it all, that the bumbling of the government would have consequences for only the average citizen. It was unfair! So unfair! Cinna was reminded of the Ministry of Magic and how their ostriching and waffling about Voldemort allowed him and his followers to prey on the innocent people who had faith in their government. So many have died needlessly because of the ineptitude of the government, and now it seemed that Balbad was doing the same thing. But instead of a malevolent madman preying on their citizens, it was foreign currency. He was boiling with rage on behalf of Balbad. Cinna bit his lips hard enough that he tasted the thick copper of blood. He could feel a scream rise in his chest, heaving and churning to be let loose, but he didn't want to wait knocked. His silver-haired friend was resting quietly beside him, his face soft with sweet dreams. Cinna couldn't bear to disturb him. The purplet eased himself out of the bed they shared, and he quickly slid the bedroom door open and slipped out, leaving Noct none the wiser. Sinbad blinked as Cinna came out of the bedroom and came towards him. "Cinna, it's really late. What are you doing up?" "I heard you talking," the little boy mumbled. He stood before the three adults, fidgeting with his fingers. Jafar looked remorseful. "Oh, did we wake you? You can go back to bed, Cinna. We'll be quiet. Don't worry." He stooped to shoo the boy back into the bedroom. Cinna sidestepped him with a click. "No. I heard what you were talking about." Cinna interrupted Jafar's mother, henning. I want to... I heard that the... Cinna puffed a jet of air out. He clenched his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut, struggling not to yell. Suddenly he lifted his eyes to glare at Sinbad. "The king is bad!" he yelped, upset and overwhelmed. "He is bad, and he hurt his people. He's using money he knows doesn't work. He's ruining his country. That's bad! He shouldn't be king! You should stop him from being the king, because he is a bad one!" Sinbad was surprised to see the glistening of tears beginning in his son's eyes. The little boy was trembling with a rage that far outweighed his small body. He was overcome with emotion. His face was flushed and his breath was shallow. Sinbad didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and scooped his son into his arms. The king of Sindria swiftly pulled his son to his chest. He tucked Cinna's face into the crook of his neck. Sinbad curled his arms around his trembling son. Soft, shushing noises left his lips as he rubbed a hand up and down Cinna's back to soothe him. He felt small drips of sorrow wet his neck as his son's anger overwhelmed him. "Shh, Cinna, I know, shh, just let it go, I know. Soft nonsense words came out of Sinbad to comfort his son. Cinna felt wave after wave of emotion swell up inside him. He was humiliated. He was 17 years old. He shouldn't be crying like this. It was embarrassing. But he couldn't stop. He tried to slow down his sobs, but they just became more and more violent until he was coughing and gagging on his own tears. He wasn't just crying over frustration now. He was crying for Balbad, for the citizens that had to flee and became slaves, for Noct and all of Fatima's other slaves, for his mother, for himself, for every bad thing that had happened to him or that he had seen in this life. He cried. And he cried for his former life, too. He cried because the Dursleys were his only living relatives, and they hated him. He cried because his parents died doing what was right. He cried because they put their faith in their friend Peter, and he betrayed them. He cried because Sirius was dead. He cried because Remus was dead, and Tonks was dead, and Dumbledore, and Dobby, and Fred, and Cedric, and Colin Creevy, and Dennis Creevy, and Parvati, and Lavender Brown, and Justin Flinchley, and Cho Chang, and Seamus, and Dean, and Professors Flitwick, and Snape, and Moody, and Ferenz, and Trelawney, and so many other wonderful, bright, amazing people who were dead because of Voldemort. He cried because Hogwarts was a battlefield. He cried because Hogsmeade was rubble and ruins. Diagon Alley was a hole full of broken rocks and shattered lives. He cried because he died. He was 17. He wasn't supposed to die yet. It wasn't fair. Nothing had been fair. And all of the awful, overwhelming things that had happened in both of his lives welled up in his chest and came exploding in great heaving sobs and tears. Sinbad rocked back and forth slightly. He felt hot tears splash against his neck as his son sobbed over him. He was confused about how violently Cinna was crying. This outburst was about more than just the tyrannical king of Balbad. But what could it be about? With a jolt, Sinbad understood. Cinna may act like an angry little man trapped in a boy's body, constantly challenging others, taking care of and protecting Noct, being as independent as possible. But he was still a young child, and one that had faced far too many hardships to boot. The separation of his mother, his life as a slave, his hardships were far too much for any child to bear. Balbad wasn't the whole reason for this breakdown. It had just been the final straw. His poor, sweet son was finally letting go of all that had been piled on his young shoulders in his life. Cinna needed comfort. He needed an adult. Needed Sinbad to comfort and care for him. He had been so brave for so long. It was amazing he had lasted this long without an outburst. But he had Sinbad now. Cinna could afford to be a child. He could depend on Sinbad. His son was finally beginning to depend on him. Maybe even trust him a little. Sinbad felt guilty that he should be so grateful that his son was so distraught, even if that meant that he could care for him. It took some time. The room was painfully silent, save for Cinna's heaving sobs and soft wails of despair. Jafar and Masrur said nothing as they stood witness. Both were afraid to move and alert Cinna to their presence. They just watched their king and unknowingly their prince hold each other tightly. For some long hours, Sinbad held Cinna to his chest until his sobs finally faded to soft coughs and sniffles. Cinna? Sinbad kept a hand rubbing soft circles on his back. Do you feel better? Uh-huh, Cinna hiccuped. Do you want to go to bed? It's late, and I'm sure you're tired. Sinbad stood up and began walking to the bedroom. Cinna was exhaustingly perched on his hips. Yeah. Cinna let out a little yawn. He felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The king of Cinderia was very careful to tuck Cinna under the covers without waking Noct. He pulled the soft blanket up to Cinna's chin and absently checked that Noct was covered securely too. Good night, Cinna. I'll see you in the morning, he whispered. Good night, his son mumbled, sleep already relaxing his expression. Sinbad felt an ache twinge in his chest at the sight of thick tear stains covering his little face. Sinbad waited a moment to see if the boy was deeply asleep before he ducked down and laid a kiss on his brow, careful not to wake him. Good night, son, he breathed as soft as he dared. Sinbad went back to the front room where Jafar and Masrur were waiting. Nicely done, Sin, Jafar commented softly. I expected you to panic. Honestly. I did too, Sinbad laughed. But when he started crying, I don't know, I just reacted. He collapsed on the couch. His robe was still damp, but he felt more awake than before. His body was energized for some reason. Jafar, how long before the fog troop issue is dealt with? How long until we can return to Sindria and tell Cinna about his status, you mean? Well, the sooner we call on the Sindrian ambassadors and have them work out the best deal for maintaining Sindria interests, we can leave by the end of the week, hopefully. If Balbad collapses, then there will be a flood of refugees. Many will come to Sindria, Sinbad theorized. He seemed sad at the inevitable fall of Rashid's kingdom. Yes, unfortunately, Sindria does not have the resources nor the land available for the sudden influx of citizenship. We would have to turn many away. But if Balbad collapses, then their fishing isles will be abandoned, Masrur piped up from the wall. Jafar turned to him unhappily. True, but if Atman marries a co-princess, the islands will officially belong to Ko. So, what of the Yellow Steppes? Sinbad questioned. The island chain closest to Sindria? Yes, those will belong to Ko as well. Jafar's tone changed, becoming suspicious. I don't like the idea of the Ko Empire expanding too close by. We can't allow Balbad to fall under Ko control. Sinbad nodded. I didn't expect you to be so anti-Ko. Is this because of their conquest of smaller nations around the world? They've expanded their colonies by more than half in just a few years. Do you perhaps feel threatened? Jafar sarcastically commented. Sinbad sniffed but didn't answer. So, will we interfere then? To stop Ahmad's wedding or to destroy the Ko? How would we do that, Sin? He wanted his orders to be clear. No room for confusion. We can't allow Balbad to join the Ko. So whatever means we have to in order to deprive Ko of Balbad territories, we will do. Sinbad sternly said. So even assassination is on the table then? Jafar's voice was pointedly casual. He knew how hard it was on Sinbad to even contemplate killing the sons of his good friend. But if it was for the good of Sindria, there was very little that Sinbad would balk at. Sinbad, getting rid of a co-princess would be too dangerous. It would have to be Ahmad, Jafar said quietly, trying to be gentle, making sure his king knew just who he would be assassinating. I understand that. Let's try to exhaust all other options before we go ahead with that, though. As you wish, my king. Jafar accepted his orders. Wait until there was no other choice, but the moment other avenues were lost to them, he had to take the Balbad king and deputy king down. This would then fall back on the will of the former king. Rashid made sure to put that Sinbad would inherit the Balbad lands and territories if, and only if, all of Rashid's children had passed, with obvious exclusions of murder or suspicious accident. Jafar could easily see to it that their deaths looked natural. This course of action would deny Ko the Balbad territories and simultaneously expand Sindria by a huge mass of trading islands and coasts. And the best part was that it was in accordance to the Seven Seas Alliance, no breaching of any agreements, and completely legal. The Ko and Rim empires would be seething at Sindria's success, and the Seven Seas Alliance would remain intact. Masrur began sniffing the air. He twisted his head towards the hotel door. Morgiana has returned. She brought another. I do not recognize the scent. Could it be Aladdin's friend? Jafar wondered. Morgiana was familiar with him as well. She could track him if she had a scent trail to follow. Well then, let's see what Ali Baba the Wonder has to say. The three men stalked out in the hallway to spy on the room across. Sinbad was crouched low with his ear against the wall, using a cup to amplify sound. Jafar was behind him, exasperatingly complaining about the demeaning spying method, but that didn't stop him from doing the same thing. Masrur was the only standing one. He stared down on his king, with no expression. Only the slightest impression of judgment came from him. They managed to hear most of Ali Baba's monologue. At least they got the important parts. Sinbad hummed. So, he's the former king's illegitimate child. Sinbad felt a zing of irritation. How could Rashid never tell him? He could understand the confliction his late friend had to have been experiencing before his death. His true-born sons were mockeries and idiotic, while his base-born progeny was the only one worth acknowledging. It was a difficult situation for any man, let alone a king, and he never bothered to confide in him. His friend, his mentor, didn't think Sinbad needed to know. He would never admit it aloud, but he felt not a small amount of hurt. Really now, Sin, eavesdropping on them is in such bad taste, Jafar complained. Sinbad turned to his advisor. Shush! He couldn't hear them inside. More murmurs came from inside the room. Sinbad could hear about the economic corruption from the government and Rashid's son's connection to the bandit troop. Young Ali Baba's confliction was relatable. Sinbad could understand how heavy the weight of a country could be on young shoulders. Add that to the confusion of an old friend turned enemy turned friend. And young Ali Baba was in quite a situation, wasn't he? Aladdin spoke to Ali Baba, offering his assistance in saving the country. While he listened, Sinbad felt a small zing of apprehension. Could Ali Baba be Aladdin's king candidate? That didn't bode well. He'd have to consider that later. A muffled explosion made him and Jafar jerk away from the wall. Screams could be heard all over the hotel. The rich guests who believed they were safe in a hotel now found themselves facing a large number of violent criminals. They scurried around like a disturbed nest of rats, trying to flee the Fog troop. But wherever they turned, another troop member appeared, and the rich citizens of Wabat were being taken captive. Another crash, and the hallway wall next to them fell away. A mob of bandits emerged from the smoke. Sinbad, Jafar, and Masrur stood in front of the room door. The boys were still inside. Hopefully they would know to stay inside the room and out of harm's way. 3 bandits stood in front with crossbows. A rather pretty woman commanded them to fire. Finish them off! She roared. With a twang, the bolts came flying at them. Masrur lifted a large marble side table and deflected the arrows. Jafar darted to the side and attacked the bandits. His throwing blades destroyed the crossbows. He yelped, Sin! Sinbad leapt over the table, shouting, Lend this to me! He quickly engaged a scarred man in a sword fight. His opponent was an ugly, thick-set sort of ruffian. His face was badly healed, and one eye was covered with a dirty rag. It looks to me like you launched this attack knowing exactly who I was, Sinbad commented dryly. The fierce-looking man gave Sinbad a nasty smile. "You're right about that. We did," gurgled Sinbad. And acidic smoke oozed out of his sword and began eating away at Sinbad's blade. Sinbad gritted his teeth and leapt away from the melting sword and began dodging the man's clumsy swipes and swings. "Come on, you'll sound useless!" Jafar groped. "Shut up!" Sinbad yelled back. He swung his arms out and hit the scarred man in the gut. "Ow!" he hacked and stumbled backward. What in blazes was that?" he demanded before gagging and vomiting a handful of blood. "Hassan!" the swordswoman gasped. "Making me waste my margot like that." Sinbad growled in contempt at the downed man. A man's voice came from the stairwell. "Qasim, Hazim, they're on the roof!" At the cry of information, the woman gave a command. She hoisted the man she called Hassan on her back. "Let's get out of here! Go now!" she shrieked, glaring balefully at the trio of men before her. She let her men go ahead of her up the stairs and then quickly followed them, barely slowed by the heavy load she carried. "It seems they're getting away," Sinbad commented wryly. "How amusing. They think we will let them go," Jafar replied. "They're on the roof," Mesro reported evenly. "Then let's go meet them."